Hello, thanks for watching this video describing the white paper that we've written summarizing the literature on trust in American elections. Now, this is, of course, timely and urgent issue, and there's been a huge flowering of the literature in a lot of different scientific disciplines, but focused on political science that has been published over the last 5 years, probing the causes and the consequences of distrust in American elections. And what we do in this white paper is summarize that literature, talk about what we know, where the gaps are in the literature, and then talk about some of the key questions and future study areas that we think are important going forward. We hope you have the chance to read this full white paper and especially to use the bibliography that we provide at the end, which has citations to the peer-reviewed journal articles that present rigorous evidence about trust in elections. But for now, we're going to summarize that in this short video, which describes our white paper titled Communicating with Voters to Build Trust in the U.S. Election System. It's jointly authored with Olivier Bergeron-Boutin of Dartmouth College, Catherine Clayton of Stanford University, Brendan Nyhan of Dartmouth College, Lauren Prather of the University of California at San Diego, and my name's Thad Kauser. I'm from UC San Diego as well. So let's start with one of the key things we know about the determinants of trust in elections. And this comes from studies across U.S. elections over the last half century. And it's something we see in all major established democracies and also in some of the emerging democracies. And what that is called the winner-loser gap. What we know from election after election is whichever side loses becomes less trusting in the general democratic system as a whole, and specifically in the results of a given election. Now, what's driving that? Well, there's evidence both that it's driven by what leaders say about elections and what people think about elections, right? That when losing politicians claim fraud, their voters believe in them. It casts doubt, and they're apt to accept those explanations much more than when they've won. Also, there seems to be a general psychological social effect where people either because they're just generally so down about losing an election, or because they think, hey, me and everyone else who I talked to about this election, we thought we were going to win. That also, that surprise to those expectations causes them potentially to lose faith in elections. So this winner-loser gap is a big effect, but its magnitude and its persistence can really vary with how political leaders react to the situation, right? So when losing elites reinforce distrust, right? When the person who lost an election claims fraud, we see bigger drops in confidence in that election among that politician's parties. We know this from observational evidence, from surveys. We know this from survey experiments. If you expose people to information about leaders claiming fraud, the members of that leader's party will decline in their trust in that election. We also see that repeated losses, right? If one side is losing election after election, that can drive trust further down. What can be done to actually increase trust? Well, there is some hopeful evidence, although this is an area that, as we'll say, needs further study. So one of the things we know is that politicians can sometimes diffuse distrust, right? When a politician who's on the losing side says, no, an election was fair, we know from survey experiments that expose voters to that messaging, we know that this can sometimes increase their trust. Doesn't work with every single politician, but there are hopeful signs that when losers accept the legitimacy of elections, that can lead to acceptance among voters. Also, we're seeing preliminary evidence from survey experiments that show when election officials present information about elections, saying that they can be trusted, and more importantly, providing information showing why they should be trusted, that signal can restore trust in elections. And let me just take a moment to talk to you about some of the rigorous evidence and the experimental approach that many of these studies use. So the idea here is that in a broadly representative survey that reflects the overall population of the country, if we expose half the people randomly chosen to one of these messages and half the people randomly chosen to a control group, some message that doesn't say anything about election trust. And we see greater trust among the people who saw the positive messages or lower trust among the people who saw the negative messages. We can conclude that that message really caused that trust. And we do see both positive and negative effects from elite rhetoric and from election officials. All right. One of the areas where we don't see big effects on trust is by the set of laws that are designed to make elections more trustworthy. So if you look at voter integrity reforms, now, one of the things we want to make clear, it's not within the scope of this white paper to evaluate whether these reforms are good in all aspects, and many of them may bring some damaging downsides. But these changes, whether it's voter ID, changes to voting by mail, ballot tracking methods of allowing people to know when their vote by mail ballot comes in. If you look at changes in public perceptions, they're really not strongly reactive in the evidence that we see so far in the literature to these reforms. Why might this be the case? Well, one, the decentralized American electoral system means that elections are being run differently across the states, sometimes even differently within the states, and getting that information out there about what reforms have been put in place is very hard when we have more than 50 electoral systems in the United States. The second thing is, even if these proposals do reduce fraud, it's very hard to prove the negative. It's very hard to prove the absence of fraud. The media understandably focuses on a few irregularities that come out in nearly every election cycle. And if there's not the proper context put into that reporting, people might think that this is happening everywhere systematically. And so even if fraud is, as study after study has shown in American politics, vanishingly rare, it's hard to prove that negative. And finally, there's this vulnerability to isolated incidents where one or two places there are problems, they get all the focus, they get all the attention, and voters might lack trust in an otherwise very trustworthy system. What are some of the key gaps in the literature, some of the things that we think scholars still need to learn about elections and trust? One of the things is exactly this question of whether reforms can spur trust if voters are actually informed about them, right? And so then there we think it might be really fruitful for scholars to use what are called field experiments. So these work a lot like those survey experiments, right? So instead of just taking a group of people who are in your survey and randomly dividing them between people who got one message and people who didn't, these field experiments go out into the world, and they either through knocking on people's doors, mailing them information, perhaps broadcasting it, or providing it digitally, they give a random group of people, randomly chosen people, information about these reforms or about messages from officials, and see whether that changes their behavior in any way. And we think field experiments that look at either voting reforms or the messages of election officials or their attempts to correct any mis or disinformation that is out there in the world, that those field experiments could be really helpful to let us know in the broader world whether reforms or whether messaging have a big impact on political behavior. Finally, there's another area where we don't see clear evidence yet of how trust is affected, and that's in the reporting practices. One of the things that's changed in American elections is as more people vote by mail, and for very legitimate reasons, ballots are arriving after Election Day, many from overseas military, many from people who have legitimately cast a ballot according to state law. But that brings a delay in when election results are reported. Fewer of the elections are able to be called immediately. And so one question is, does that lead to any erosion of trust? And can messaging and explanations of why there are legitimate reasons for it taking a while to count all of the legitimately cast ballots, whether those messages can counteract any of the potential drop in trust that would come from election results that are reported days after an election day. What do we see about the effects of transparency? Many election officials across the country are opening up their vote centers, having video cameras so people can watch vote counting. Is that something that restores trust in election? Experiments could show whether that is in fact the case. How does that affect trust when voting margins change for reasonable reasons during the process of counting ballots day after an election? And finally, how do media narratives, right? How does the way that that the news media present election results, how does that change trust in elections? Those are all areas ripe for further study. Voter experience and voter expectation also need a closer look, we think, right? So one of the things that we don't have is panel data that looks and tracks voters from before an election to what their experiences are on election day or an election month when they vote, if they vote early or through the mail. How does that voting experience change their level of trust? By tracking individual voters through that process, we could learn important lessons on how their interaction with the electoral system affects their trust in that system. Also, voter expectations. So many people have a guess about who's going to win going into an election. These data here show that that guess is generally right. So what these data show here for Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right is on the x-axis we have how the election actually turned out, what the Democratic share of the two-party vote was. On the y-axis we have how people guessed the election was going to turn out, right? Their prediction of whether their party would win by quite a bit. What you see is for both parties, this lines up pretty closely. Right? Most people are pretty good at guessing. Is this going to be a good year for us or a bad year for us? One of the observations that stands out is the year 2020. Republicans were quite confident in a win that was not delivered. And so that could play a role in the lack of trust that many Republicans reported after the 2020 election. Similarly, in 2016, by not as large a margin, but Democrats overestimated their chances of winning. And that could be a contributor potentially to the drop in Democratic trust that happened after that election. So that's an area that could use better causal inference, right? Again, survey experiments that brought information that changed electoral expectations. Let's see how that affects trust. That could be an area for future research. And then finally, but vitally importantly, we ask whether the members of racial and ethnic minority groups, Black voters, Latino voters, Indigenous Americans who have for a century or more faced obstacles to voting, faced slavery, faced disfranchisement, and all of these things could add up to a much lower level of trust in our election system. We think this is an understudied area. Just as an initial glimpse into this area, we looked at the survey of the performance of American elections conducted after every recent election by the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, and we looked at levels of trust by racial and ethnic groups. So this is just correlational. It deserves further research. But one of the things that you see, if you look at this top left corner here, people's trust that their own vote would be counted correctly. White Americans, who are this blue line, have the strongest levels, highest levels of trust in every election. Black Americans are the yellow line, Latinos in the green line, trust levels that are significantly lower in the 2016 election. Now, trust levels got to be much more equal by race after the 2020 election. And you see this in people's trust of votes at the county level and their state level. But for every period here, there was a gap where members of racial and ethnic minorities, and we see Asian Americans here in red, were less trusting of their own ballot being counted than white Americans. If you look at the nation's vote, some of these patterns are different. So there's complexity here given which level of election you're talking about and what's going on in that election, this difference between 2016 and 2020. And we think this area deserves further study. Key areas to look at: how do changes, and again, by using the word reform, we just mean this is a change to voting, and it's up to other studies to determine whether these are good or bad reasons, good or bad changes. But how does voter ID Or how do post-election audits affect trust? What reporting practices most effectively increase trust? Either the way that election officials report the vote and put that up on their website, or the way that the news media reports that. How do people's experiences when they cast a ballot, either at the poll or through the mail or at a drop box or at an early vote center, how does that affect their trust? And is there really the link between inflated electoral expectations and mistrust in election? And then finally, what messaging builds trust among the groups that face barriers to participation? So what can be done to close this gap, or what legal changes need to be made in order to ensure that all Americans trust elections? We want to close by advocating for collaboration between election officials and scholars. This is a trend that's really taken off in the last few years, and we see this partnership that informs research being vital to making research more applicable to this urgent question. We think testing the effects of legal changes and of election official messages with field experiments is vital, and all of these combined could help promote resilience against the efforts to undermine the legitimacy of American elections. All right. Thank you so much for listening, and this will conclude our presentation.